Hi, my name's Arpito, and this is Asian American Studies 353, Filipino and Filipino American Identities. I want to start today's lecture a little bit differently. I want to ask you this question. Do you recognize this place? This is the Victory Monument, also called the Dewey Monument, in Union Square in downtown San Francisco. After doing some Christmas shopping, back when we used to be able to shop in malls, do you remember ever walking around Union Square and seeing this monument? Have you ever read the inscription on the monument? You might be really surprised to see what it says. Erected by the citizens of San Francisco to commemorate the victory of the American Navy under Commodore George Dewey at Manila Bay on May 1st, 1898. And under that paragraph, on May 23rd, 1901, the ground for this monument was broken by President William McKinley. Do you remember a couple of lessons ago when I talked about a quote from Keith Bosso about place worlds? Well, one way you can wrap your head around this monument that was plopped down in the middle of San Francisco was that it was erected in order to create a place world. As you're staring at the monument, there's actually a 9-foot statue standing on top of the pillar, and that's supposedly the goddess of victory. And that's partly the reason why it's called the Victory Monument, but not completely. In the goddess's hands is a trident on one hand, and then a wreath on the other. Both of these are symbols that represent supposedly two powerful figures in US history. The trident, supposed to be the Admiral of the Navy, George Dewey, who I mentioned earlier, while the wreath is for William McKinley, the 25th President of the United States. I wanted to start today's lesson by talking about the Victory Monument because it really helps me to illustrate two important ideas. And both of these ideas are really important to understand the topic of today's lesson, the Philippine American War. And that's represented by the fact that the monument, one of the most important symbols of the Philippine American War, was erected in San Francisco and not anywhere else in the country. And the second point that I want to make is that very few people actually know about the Philippine American War, including Filipino Americans. And you can imagine that there are far fewer people who have ever questioned why. Why is there a monument that celebrates the colonization of the Philippines and specifically the deaths of over 250,000 Filipino soldiers and civilians, smacked right dab in the center of the city in the heart of its commercial district? In the last lecture, I helped explain why Spanish colonialism had such a lasting influence on Filipino society and the identities of Filipinos. In today's lecture, I want to explain exactly why the United States chose to colonize the Philippines in the first place. And all of this will help me to lay the groundwork to explain why American colonialism was just as influential to Filipino society as Spanish colonialism, if not more. And I'm saying all of this when American colonialism in the Philippines only lasted about 50 years officially. Now, San Francisco also happened to be a key destination for another key figure in this story, Jose Rizal. I could spend several lectures talking about the significance of Jose Rizal to Filipino and Filipino Americans. In the Philippines, there's actually an entire academic field called Rizal Studies. That just gives you some idea about the significance of this individual, who many in the Philippines still revere as the most important national figure in Philippine history. The story of the Philippine American War actually starts with Jose Rizal and the political battle that he waged against the Catholic Church in the Philippines. This battle actually started in the same way that lots of revolutions all throughout the world had started in the 1800s, through literature and propaganda. It's important to note that Jose Rizal and all of his propagandist colleagues, also known as ilustrados, grew up with immense privilege, both in terms of wealth and education. And all of this privilege allowed them to travel across the world, and they were able to witness the burgeoning of democracy all throughout the world in Europe and also in the United States, which is why Jose Rizal went to San Francisco in the first place. All of the ilustrados, including Jose Rizal, were inspired by these revolutions and democracy, and particularly the ideals of equality. And as Rizal was watching all of these movements for equality happening throughout the world, he became incredibly fed up with the fact that he was treated as a second-class citizen in his own homeland. Even though Rizal grew up with immense privilege, and that privilege allowed him to get a PhD and a medical doctorate, he was still looked down upon in the place of his birth because he was a mestizo. Sangli mestizo, actually. Chinese and Spanish. All of this anger led him to writing 2 books, and both of these books would eventually inspire the entire revolution against the Spanish monarchy and the tyranny of the Catholic Church by the end of the 1800s. And it was these 2 books and the anger that they incited that led him to be executed on December 30th, 1896, but not before the match was already lit. This brings us full circle back to the Victory Monument. Now, according to the inscription, it was Admiral George Dewey who had saved Filipinos from the tyrannical clutch of Spanish rule. He was the one who had freed Filipinos. Are you starting to see the connections here? In reality, it was years of fighting Filipino revolutionaries that depleted the Spanish galleon that George Dewey went over that day in Manila Bay. Contrary to the Dewey Monument, Dewey didn't save anyone. There was nothing triumphant about what he did. Just think about it. By the time George Dewey arrived to Manila Bay, there were only 6 ships remaining of the entire Spanish Armada protecting Manila Bay that day. And that's why at the end of the battle, there was a total of 7 soldiers who were wounded. None of them even died. But that victory over Spain meant that the independence that Filipinos had won from their colonial masters was nullified by the United States purchasing the Philippines for $20 million from Spain through the Treaty of Paris. Emilio Aguinaldo would reject that purchase as the first democratically chosen president of the Philippines ever, when he organized the Malolos Congress to prove that the Philippines was like any other democratic country and should be recognized as being independent. But the American government didn't care. That just as Dewey easily subdued the Spanish Navy in Manila, it would be even easier to subjugate what he thought were unorganized gangs in the Philippines. So less than a year later, the Philippines would be invaded by American soldiers, kicking off the Philippine American War in 1899. Similar to how ongoing war with Iraq began with lies about weapons of mass destruction in 2003, the sinking of an American ship called the USS Maine in Havana was used as an excuse for the US to go to war with Spain in 1898. You see, the US was chomping at the bit to become an imperial power, just like Spain and England before it. And now that the Spanish Empire was crumbling because of decades and centuries of conflict, the American government took the moment in order to claim some of its territories. But the Philippines is in the Pacific, all the way on the other side of the United States, where Havana is, closer to the Atlantic. Why would the US want the Philippines? Wasn't the United States in danger of doing something, the same thing that Spain had done, by colonizing territories far away from its shores? Well, you can understand their motivation by this quote from San Francisco Mayor John Phelan. Colonizing the Philippines would allow the United States to begin opening trade with China. In order to do that, it needed docking points in order to fuel its ships. And that's the actual reason why the United States ended up claiming Hawaii and Guam as well. Also that it can commence trade with China. So by 1902, General Funston, of Fort Funston fame, yes, that Fort Funston, had captured Aguinaldo that year. Controversially, it was actually Filipinos who had helped capture Aguinaldo, a group of Filipinos called the Macabebes, but that's another story. And through lots of compromises with the Philippine elite, Taft installed the American colonial government in the Philippines. What I need to emphasize here is that McKinley was wrong. Filipinos had been fighting foreign powers for centuries by the time the United States entered the Philippines. And all of these soldiers who had been training in the Presidio and leaving San Francisco to fight in this war were totally unmatched to fight Filipinos in the jungles of the Philippines. And that's why the American military ended up sending some of its most bloodthirsty soldiers who had fought Native Americans in the Indian Wars, to lead the charge in the Philippines. The United States had to match the aggression of Filipino fighters. It's why Funston relied on Filipinos to capture Aguinaldo. It's why battles and violence had persisted for over a decade after the war was supposedly over. And it's why the Philippine American War is actually called the First Vietnam for many historians. And lastly, the Philippine American War is where the entwined history between African Americans and Filipinos began. So imagine this, you're fighting thousands of miles away from home, fighting alongside a lot of soldiers who actually hate you for being black. And as you're fighting, you're listening to a lot of these soldiers call Filipinos niggers and goo-goos. There are a lot of historical documents that show us how white American soldiers likened Filipinos to the black folks they hated and murdered in the United States. General Emilio Aguinaldo was a masterful strategist, and he actually used this duality to his advantage. He told his soldiers to drop leaflets encouraging African Americans to fight alongside Filipinos, and some of them did. These soldiers were actually called Buffalo Soldiers, and many of the surviving Buffalo Soldiers stayed in the Philippines and started families with indigenous Filipinos. And that's where jazz was actually introduced to the Philippines for the first time, starting the long history of jazz in the Philippines. But again, that's another story, one that I might be able to talk about later on in the semester. The Philippine American War continues to be a major topic of discussion for Filipino Americans today, mostly because it helps us to understand how we got here in the first place. And by how we got here, I mean that both literally and metaphorically. My mentor at UC Berkeley, for instance, Catherine Sinisa Choi, uses this moment in American history to explain why there are so many Filipino nurses who continue to work all throughout the United States today. And it might also help you to understand why some of your parents are encouraging you to become nurses someday too. You can watch the Vox video that talks about what Catherine Sinisa Choi thinks by clicking over here. But the Philippine American War also helps a lot of us to think more about American imperialism as a whole, and why it is there continues to be testaments celebrating American imperialism everywhere, from statues to the names of parks, even street names all throughout the city of San Francisco. All of this creates a place world that uniquely impacts Filipino Americans. And soon I'll get to talk about why it is that American colonialism impacted Filipino Americans in ways that Spanish colonialism never could. But all of that will come later.